Part 1. There are secrets that only a family knows, and there are secrets only the police ever hear, but once in a while a secret slips through the cracks, and when it does, it changes everything you thought you understood about a case that never truly went cold, it only went quiet. And tonight we begin with one question that refuses to stay buried. What if the detail everyone overlooked was the one thing that could not have come from anywhere except inside the house or inside the investigation itself? The story does not begin with flashing lights or a body or a courtroom. It begins with a voice on a live stream, a casual sentence spoken too confidently, a moment that passed too quickly for most viewers, but not for those who have lived inside the shadows of unresolved cases, because when you have followed enough of them, you learn that truth rarely announces itself. It leaks out sideways in tone and timing, in the things people say without realizing they have said too much. The case centers around a woman whose name has circulated for years, whispered in forums, discussed in podcasts, dissected by armchair investigators, and quietly monitored by law enforcement, not because there was ever a dramatic confession or a shocking arrest, but because something about the story never lined up, not from the first press statement, not from the early family interviews, not from the way certain details were remembered too clearly while others were strangely absent. In the early days, the official narrative was simple enough: an unexpected tragedy, a sudden loss, a family asking for privacy, a community urged to move on. But cases like this never really move on. They settle into the background where time blurs memory and the absence of answers becomes its own kind of presence, and for years that is where this one stayed, hovering just out of reach, unresolved but not forgotten. What changed was not new evidence or a reopened investigation. What changed was attention, because in the age of live streams and long-form discussions, nothing stays buried forever, and when people talk long enough, they begin to contradict themselves, they begin to reveal patterns, and sometimes they say something that only two groups of people could possibly know: family or police. That is the moment that started everything again. During a live broadcast meant to discuss unrelated developments, the speaker referenced a specific detail, a procedural detail, something that had never been released publicly, something that was not included in early news reports, not mentioned in press conferences, not available through court filings or freedom of information requests. It was the kind of detail that exists only in two places: inside investigative files and inside the lived memory of those present when everything first fell apart. The moment passed almost unnoticed, but it was captured, clipped, replayed, slowed down, and shared among a small group of viewers who knew enough to recognize the problem immediately, because if that information was never public, how did it become part of casual conversation years later? At first there were rational explanations. Maybe it had been leaked quietly, maybe it appeared briefly in a report before being removed, maybe someone misspoke. But as the days went on and the clip circulated, those explanations collapsed one by one, because no version of the public record supported what had been said. And that was when the story reopened, not officially but socially, and sometimes social pressure is the spark law enforcement never admits they respond to. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the beginning, to the timeline everyone thought they knew, the day everything changed, the hours that followed, the phone calls, the statements, the silences, and the decisions that shaped the narrative from the very start. According to early reports, the incident occurred during a narrow window of time, one that left very little room for error or coincidence. The timeline was clean, almost too clean, with just enough uncertainty to explain away inconsistencies, but not enough to invite serious scrutiny. And for a while that was enough, because people want to believe that tragedies make sense even when they do not. Family members spoke of shock, disbelief, confusion. Their grief was real, no one disputes that, but grief does not cancel accountability, and it does not explain why certain facts were emphasized while others were minimized. From the very first interviews, certain phrases repeated verbatim across multiple appearances, almost as if rehearsed, almost as if someone had already decided which version of events needed to survive. Law enforcement on their part released minimal information, citing the sensitivity of the case and the need to protect the investigation, which is standard procedure. But standard procedure becomes suspicious when it stretches on for years without resolution, especially when no clear suspect is ever named and no meaningful updates are provided. Behind-the-scenes records were sealed, evidence remained undisclosed, and slowly public interest faded, except among those who do not let go easily: the researchers, the analysts, the families who have lived through their own unanswered losses and recognize the signs of something unfinished. Those signs were their early small inconsistencies in timing, questions about who was present and when, unexplained delays, gaps between actions and reactions, moments where logic bent slightly out of shape, not enough to prove wrongdoing but enough to make certainty impossible. Then came the silence, and silence is powerful because it allows one version of events to harden into accepted truth simply by being the only version available. But silence also preserves mistakes, and years later, when someone speaks too freely, those preserved mistakes reappear unchanged, waiting to be noticed. The livestream comment did exactly that. It cracked the surface of the silence, and once cracked, it could not be resealed. People began re-examining old footage, transcripts, police statements, timelines, and witness remarks, and slowly a pattern emerged, not of clear guilt but of controlled information, a narrative that seemed curated rather than discovered. One of the most troubling aspects was how certain investigative details appeared to be compartmentalized, selectively remembered by some and entirely unknown to others, and that is not how shared grief usually behaves. Families remember everything or nothing, but rarely just the parts that align with official procedure, unless those parts were emphasized repeatedly behind closed doors. As attention grew, so did discomfort. Responses to questions became defensive, dismissive, or redirected. Technical language was used where emotional language once appeared, and explanations shifted subtly over time, not enough to trigger alarms on their own, but enough to suggest that something was being protected, whether that something was a person, a reputation, or simply a past decision no one wanted to revisit. And this is where part 1 ends, not with an answer but with a threshold, because once you accept that a detail could only have come from family or police, the circle tightens dramatically and the list of possibilities shrinks, and in part 2 we follow that detail back to its origin, tracing who knew it, when they knew it, and why it matters more than anyone initially realized. Part 2. Once the question was asked, it could not be unasked, because knowing that a detail could only exist within two circles immediately forces the investigation inward, and when the focus shifts inward, every relationship, every conversation, and every past decision begins to look different, because now the mystery is no longer about what happened but about who knew what and when they knew it. The detail itself was not dramatic on its face. It was not a confession or a weapon or a piece of forensic evidence. It was procedural, a step taken during the earliest phase of the response, the kind of step that only occurs after law enforcement has already made specific internal determinations, and the kind of step family members would only be aware of if they were told directly by officers at the scene or afterward in private briefings. That matters because public information follows a strict pattern. Initial reports are broad, deliberately vague, and stripped of investigative nuance. Anything more precise is held back until charges are filed or the case is closed, and in this situation neither ever happened, which means the detail should have remained sealed indefinitely. So how did it surface? To answer that, investigators, both official and unofficial, began reconstructing the flow of information from the first critical hours: who arrived first, who spoke to whom, who was briefed privately, and which officers were assigned to which roles, because every investigation generates an invisible map of knowledge, and once you map it, you can see where leaks or transfers become possible. Records show that within the first hour only a handful of people possessed the full procedural picture: responding officers, supervisors, a forensic lead, and two family members present during a private exchange that never appeared in any public transcript. And this is where the story tightens, because the livestream speaker was not among responding officers and had no documented role in the investigation. Which leaves one possibility uncomfortable but unavoidable: the information had to come through personal channels. When questioned indirectly, the response was vague references to memory, assumptions, and things said over the years, but assumptions do not replicate exact procedural language, and memory does not invent terminology that matches internal reports word for word, and analysts noticed that the phrasing used on the livestream mirrored the language style of law enforcement documentation: not family speech, not casual recollection, but institutional wording. That discovery pushed the story out of speculation and into pattern recognition, because patterns are harder to dismiss than accusations, and once patterns emerge, they tend to replicate elsewhere, and replicate they did. Researchers revisiting old interviews began noticing similar linguistic fingerprints: moments where technical phrasing appeared unexpectedly, moments where timelines were described with investigative precision rather than emotional recall, and moments where explanations aligned too neatly with police rationale even when those rationales had never been publicly justified. This raised a second and far more serious question: whether the family narrative had been partially shaped by law enforcement from the very beginning, not necessarily with malicious intent, but with the goal of containment of uncertainty, containment of liability, or containment of a decision made too early to walk back later. In many cases, early assumptions become anchors. Once an investigation commits to a direction, reversing course requires admitting error, and institutions rarely do that without overwhelming pressure. So instead, information is managed, narratives are stabilized, and silence is framed as respect or sensitivity. But time changes the equation, because people forget what was supposed to remain private. They forget which details were never meant to leave closed rooms, and eventually someone speaks freely, believing enough years have passed that the context is gone, but context never disappears, it waits. The livestream moment reopened that context and with it reopened scrutiny of the initial ruling because rulings are conclusions and conclusions demand foundations and the foundation here was starting to look less stable the deeper analysts dug. One overlooked document revealed that the procedural step referenced could only have occurred after a specific internal assessment, an assessment that was never acknowledged publicly and never documented in released summaries, which suggests that the official explanation skipped a stage entirely, moving directly from event to conclusion without transparency. If that is true, then the investigation did not simply end, it was guided to an ending, and guidance is different from resolution because guidance leaves unanswered questions behind. Family members were not accused, but their proximity to information became impossible to ignore, especially when compared to what they publicly denied, knowing discrepancies appeared not in facts but in certainty, moments where knowledge was denied too firmly, too quickly, as if rehearsed rather than recalled. Psychologists who reviewed the footage noted a subtle shift over time. Early interviews were emotionally raw, later ones became structured, almost strategic. Grief turned into messaging, which can happen naturally, but combined with technical accuracy, it suggested preparation. Meanwhile, law enforcement maintained their position: no updates, no comment, no reopening, but silence in the face of renewed attention is itself a response, because silence communicates confidence or avoidance, and neither settles doubt. As the circle narrowed, one name began appearing repeatedly, not as a suspect but as a conduit, a person positioned between family and police, someone present during briefings, someone trusted by both sides, and someone who appeared frequently in early coordination efforts before fading from public view. This individual had access without authority, proximity without responsibility, and memory without documentation, a perfect bridge for information to cross unnoticed, and when analysts traced interactions, timelines aligned too cleanly to ignore. And that is where Part 2 leaves us, standing at the edge of implication, not accusation but implication, because once information crosses a boundary it leaves fingerprints, and in Part 3 we follow that bridge, examining the role of intermediaries and the quiet decisions that may have shaped the story long before anyone realized the truth was still unsettled. Part 3. By the time attention settled on the intermediary, the investigation had crossed an invisible line, because identifying a bridge between family and law enforcement transforms uncertainty into structure, and structure forces accountability, whether anyone is ready for it or not, because now the story is no longer abstract, it has a shape, and a shape can be examined. The individual at the center of this shift was never introduced to the public as significant. They were described in early reports only tangentially: a helper, a liaison, a supportive presence, someone who stepped in during chaos and then stepped back once things stabilized, and that alone would have been unremarkable except for how often their name appeared in private exchanges compared to how rarely it appeared in public documentation. They were present at the residence during the initial response, they accompanied family members during key moments, they spoke directly with senior officers, and according to scheduling logs they remained on site longer than some officially assigned personnel, yet they held no formal investigative role. And that contradiction matters, because access without oversight is the most dangerous form of involvement in any sensitive situation. When analysts mapped the flow of conversations, the intermediary appeared repeatedly at decision points, moments where options narrowed and conclusions solidified, always present but never recorded, always adjacent but never accountable, and this pattern raised concerns not because it proved misconduct but because it revealed opportunity. Opportunity is not guilt, but it is the soil in which influence grows, and influence does not require intent to alter outcomes. Sometimes it simply reinforces the path of least resistance, and early in the case the path of least resistance was to accept the most convenient explanation and move forward. One internal communication uncovered later referenced reassurance provided to the family, reassurance that certain outcomes were expected, that procedures were routine, and that further inquiry was unlikely. At the time those words would have felt comforting, but in hindsight they read differently, because reassurance can shape perception and perception shapes memory. Memory under stress is malleable, and when memory aligns with institutional narrative, the result is confidence without verification, and once confidence sets in, it becomes difficult to question even when new information appears. This may explain why family interviews over time grew more definitive rather than more reflective. Uncertainty was replaced by certainty, questions by statements, and emotional ambiguity by resolved language that mirrored official conclusions, even as those conclusions lacked public transparency. Meanwhile, the intermediary gradually withdrew from visibility, not abruptly but organically, fewer mentions, fewer appearances, until they were no longer part of the conversation at all, and that withdrawal coincided precisely with the period when the case shifted from active concern to administrative closure. Researchers noted that after this point documentation became minimal, updates ceased and records requests returned little of substance, as if the story had reached an endpoint without ever passing through open review. This is a common institutional behavior when reopening a case offers more risk than reward, and when doing nothing is easier than admitting something was missed, but it leaves behind a residue of feeling that the resolution was procedural rather than factual. As scrutiny increased around the intermediary, defenders argued that their role was supportive, that they acted in good faith, that they had no authority to influence outcomes, and that may be true, but authority is not the only source of influence. Proximity, timing, and trust often matter more, and this individual had all three. A critical realization emerged when analysts compared early family statements to later ones and isolated changes in phrasing that occurred after private meetings involving the intermediary. These changes were subtle shifts in emphasis, not contradictions, but recalibrations, details minimized or reframed in ways that aligned with investigative closure. It was not coaching in the dramatic sense, but guidance, gentle redirection toward explanations that felt safer, more acceptable, easier to live with, and over time those explanations became fixed memories, replacing raw recollection with curated narrative. This raised ethical questions not about intent but about responsibility, because even well-meaning guidance can distort truth, especially when delivered during trauma and reinforced by authority. Law enforcement, for their part, denied any improper influence but did not address the intermediary directly, leaving a gap in accountability that only deepened suspicion, because silence around a specific person is more telling than general denials. As public discussion grew louder, the intermediary declined all requests for comment and quietly removed themselves from associated networks, effectively disappearing from the discourse. And disappearance does not imply wrongdoing, but it does invite speculation, especially when paired with a history of access and silence. By now, the investigation had split into two parallel tracks, one focused on facts, timelines, and procedural anomalies, and another focused on narrative formation: who shaped it, who reinforced it, and who benefited from its stability. And both tracks pointed toward the same uncomfortable possibility, that the case did not end because it was solved, but because it was settled. Settled emotionally, administratively, and institutionally, but unsettled factually and unresolved ethically. And this distinction matters because justice requires more than closure, it requires confidence that truth was pursued without compromise. And this is where Part 3 closes, with the realization that the most important evidence may not be physical or forensic at all, but linguistic: the words chosen, the details repeated, and the silences maintained. And in Part 4 we will examine those silences, identifying what was never said when it should have been, and why absence can be as revealing as presence. Part 4. Silence is not empty, it is structured, and once investigators began treating silence as data, the case shifted again, because what was never said often revealed more than what was repeated. And when entire categories of information remain absent across years of discussion, that absence stops being accidental. The first silence involved timing, not the broad timeline that had been shared repeatedly, but the micro moments, the minutes between actions, the delays that were explained away vaguely or not at all. Early statements jumped from discovery to response without addressing what happened in between, as if the space itself was inconvenient. When pressed later, family members referenced confusion, shock, and emotional blur, which is understandable, but law enforcement reports typically compensate for emotional gaps with objective timestamps, yet those timestamps were never released and requests for them were denied or returned redacted, which suggests that the silence was institutional, not emotional. The second silence involved decision-making: who chose the initial classification, who approved the procedural path, who signed off on limiting further inquiry. These are standard questions in any review, yet in this case they were never answered publicly, and the absence of named decision-makers effectively removed accountability from the process, because decisions without names cannot be questioned. Another silence appeared around alternative possibilities. Early tips were acknowledged briefly and then banished from mention, not addressed, not dismissed, simply forgotten. And forgetting is convenient because it avoids contradiction, but forgotten leads leave trails, and when independent researchers traced some of those early tips, they found they had never been fully evaluated, merely noted and set aside. This pattern suggests triage rather than investigation, choices made under pressure and then protected from later scrutiny, because revisiting them would require reopening closed doors and possibly acknowledging that the original assessment was incomplete. One of the most striking silences involved expert consultation. In cases of this nature, specialists are often consulted quietly, but their involvement typically appears at least indirectly through language changes or procedural notes. Here there was no evidence of external expertise, yet technical conclusions were presented with confidence, raising questions about where that confidence originated. As attention returned to the livestream moment, analysts noticed that the same silences existed there: questions deflected, answers shortened, and specific follow-ups ignored, which reinforced the sense that certain topics were considered off limits not because they lacked relevance but because they threatened stability. The silence around internal disagreement was especially telling. Investigations of complexity almost always involve debate, differing interpretations, competing hypotheses, but in this case the public narrative suggested unanimity from the start, which is statistically improbable, and when internal debate is hidden it often indicates that one interpretation was prioritized before alternatives were fully explored. Former officers familiar with similar cases described the pattern as containment, not cover-up, but containment aimed at preventing escalation, and that distinction matters because containment can arise from fear of error rather than intent to deceive, but the outcome is the same: questions remain unanswered and trust erodes. As years passed, the silences hardened into assumptions, assumptions into beliefs, and beliefs into defenses, and by the time the livestream reopened discussion, those defenses were reflexive responses rather than reasoned positions, which is why the accidental reveal of restricted information was so destabilizing. It bypassed rehearsed explanations and exposed raw knowledge. Researchers then compared what was said publicly with what could be inferred from silence and found contradictions not in facts but in emphasis. Areas described as settled lacked foundational discussion, while minor details were overexplained as if to distract from larger gaps. This technique, whether conscious or not, is common when narratives are shaped to reduce scrutiny, focus attention where answers are safe, and leave dangerous questions unasked. The final silence involved review: no independent review, no external audit, no reopening despite renewed attention and credible analytical concerns, and this absence signaled that the institution was unwilling to re-examine its own work, which only deepened public skepticism. At this point the case reached a tipping moment, not legally but socially, because once people recognize patterns silence, they stop accepting statements at face value and begin listening for what is missing, and what was missing here was too large to ignore. And that leads us into part 5, where the consequences of silence begin to surface, not just in theory but in impact. As public trust erodes, internal pressure builds, and the possibility of reopening what was thought closed becomes harder to dismiss. Part 5. When silence holds long enough, it eventually creates pressure, and pressure does not dissipate quietly. It finds outlets, sometimes through leaks, sometimes through mistakes, and sometimes through conscience, and as the case re-entered public discussion, those outlets began to appear one by one. The first shift came from within the community, not from officials but from individuals who had been peripherally involved years earlier, people who had assumed the matter was settled and that their observations no longer mattered until they saw the live stream clip and realized that certain details were still considered sensitive, and that realization reframed their memories. Several described being advised early on not to speculate, not to discuss certain aspects, and to trust that the process would handle everything, which at the time felt reassuring but now felt restrictive, because trust is different from instruction and instruction implies control. These accounts did not accuse but they corroborated a pattern of containment, reinforcing the idea that the investigation had been narrowed quickly and that alternative interpretations were quietly discouraged, not through threats but through authority and confidence. Internally, pressure began to mount as well, because institutions are not monoliths. Individuals within them carry doubt, and doubt grows when public scrutiny aligns with private unease. Former personnel began speaking off record, acknowledging that the case never sat right, that decisions were made under constraints that were never revisited, and that reopening the matter would expose not crime but fallibility. Fallibility, however, is dangerous to institutions built on credibility, and that danger often outweighs the pursuit of truth, especially when the statute of limitations complicates outcomes and accountability becomes more symbolic than legal. As discussion intensified, media outlets began asking sharper questions, not about who was responsible but about process: why certain information remained sealed, why no independent review had been conducted, and why a procedural detail had surfaced years later without explanation. These questions shifted the narrative from speculation to governance, and governance demands answers. In response, official statements emphasized finality and the absence of new evidence, but this framing avoided the central issue because the concern was not new evidence but old information resurfacing inappropriately, and finality without transparency reads as avoidance. Meanwhile, linguistic analysts revisited the livestream clip and identified additional anomalies: subtle hesitations, word choices corrected mid-sentence, and an assumption of shared knowledge that betrayed familiarity with restricted context. These were not definitive proof, but they reinforced the original concern that the speaker believed the information was already public. That belief likely stemmed from repetition over time. Information shared privately often feels public because it circulates within a trusted group, and eventually the boundary between internal and external dissolves, and that dissolution explains accidental disclosures better than conspiracy. As the circle of awareness widened, calls for review grew louder, not from activists but from professionals, journalists, former investigators, and legal scholars who recognized the structural issues at play and framed the case as a study in institutional inertia rather than individual wrongdoing. This reframing changed the stakes because it allowed officials to engage without admitting guilt, but engagement itself requires openness, and that was the one thing still missing. Behind-the-scenes discussions reportedly began about releasing additional records, not to reopen the case but to clarify procedures and restore confidence, and even the consideration of release signaled a shift because previously the position had been absolute silence. Families involved found themselves caught between loyalty to the original narrative and the growing realization that certainty may have been premature. This tension was visible in later statements which softened in tone, acknowledged unanswered questions, and emphasized trust over facts, a subtle but meaningful change. Trust, however, is not a substitute for explanation, and the public response reflected that distinction. Patience thinned and speculation filled the gaps left by silence, proving once again that controlling information does not control narrative, it merely delays its evolution. By the end of this phase, the case stood at a crossroads. One path maintained closure at the cost of credibility, the other risked reopening wounds to address unresolved questions, and this decision point leads directly into Part 6, where the consequences of choosing clarity over comfort come into focus and the possibility of resolution begins to emerge. Part 6. Once the idea of clarity entered the conversation, it could not be contained because clarity threatens comfort, and comfort had protected the case for years, but now the balance had shifted and the cost of silence was beginning to outweigh the risk of disclosure. The first tangible change came quietly. Additional records were acknowledged, not released, but acknowledged as existing, and that admission alone altered the landscape because for years the implicit message had been that nothing more remained to be seen. Acknowledgement reframed silence from absence to withholding. Journalists familiar with institutional behavior recognize the signal immediately. When agencies prepare for disclosure, they begin by lowering expectations, managing framing, and emphasizing procedure over outcome, and that pattern appeared here. Statements focused on process integrity, on standard practices, and on the challenges of retrospective analysis. Language designed to prepare the public for partial answers rather than full transparency. Behind closed doors, internal reviews reportedly began, not criminal reviews but procedural assessments examining whether early assumptions limited later options and whether communication strategies inadvertently created long-term doubt. These reviews are often framed as lessons learned, but their existence confirms that something worth examining exists. Family members were briefed privately before any public movement, and those briefings appeared to change tone, no longer emphasizing certainty but acknowledging complexity, and that shift mattered because it suggested that the family themselves were being reintroduced to uncertainty after years of reassurance. This reintroduction was emotionally destabilizing but also clarifying because grief evolves differently when answers are absolute versus when they are provisional, and for some family members the return of questions reopened pain, while for others it validated long-held unease. The intermediary whose presence had shaped earlier phases remained absent, but their role was now being discussed openly within analytical circles, not as a villain but as an example of how informal authority can influence outcomes without accountability, and this reframing reduced defensiveness and allowed more honest discussion. As scrutiny intensified, the original procedural detail that sparked the investigation was contextualized internally. Its purpose, its timing, and its implications were examined, and what emerged was not evidence of malice but evidence of haste, a decision made quickly under pressure and then defended rather than revisited. Haste is understandable in crisis, but when haste becomes doctrine, it resists correction, and this resistance appeared to be the core issue. Not that the wrong conclusion was necessarily reached, but that alternative possibilities were never fully explored once momentum took hold. Experts consulted during the internal review reportedly agreed that the case did not warrant the degree of finality it received, and that earlier transparency would likely have prevented years of speculation. This assessment did not accuse, but it reframed the outcome as administratively closed rather than conclusively resolved. This distinction opened the door to a controlled release of information, not to assign blame but to explain decision paths and restore trust, and when institutions choose explanation over defense, they signal readiness for reconciliation with the public. The livestream speaker whose comment reignited the case issued a clarification acknowledging confusion about what was public and what was not. This admission, while limited, confirmed the central premise that restricted information had circulated informally, reinforcing the analysis that boundaries had blurred over time. Public response to this clarification was mixed. Some viewed it as validation, others as deflection, but the debate itself marked progress because it shifted from accusation to understanding how systems fail quietly. By the end of this phase, the path forward was visible, not dramatic arrests, not courtroom revelations, but something rarer, an honest accounting of how a case drifted from inquiry to closure without sufficient scrutiny and how that drift could be corrected. And that brings us to part 7, where the story does not end with punishment but with resolution, a resolution defined not by certainty but by truth acknowledged, trust repaired, and lessons learned so that silence does not again replace understanding. Part 7. The resolution did not arrive with sirens or indictments or a dramatic reversal, because real closure rarely does. Instead, it arrived with acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is the quietest form of truth but also the most enduring because it cannot be undone once spoken. After months of internal review and mounting public attention, the agency released a limited but carefully structured summary, not a defense, not an apology, but an explanation, a chronological account of early decisions, the pressures present at the time, and the reasoning that led to procedural finality without exhaustive exploration, and for the first time the missing context filled the silences that had defined the case for years. The report confirmed what analysts had long suspected, that the investigation narrowed rapidly based on early assessments that were considered sufficient at the time, and that once those assessments solidified, alternative possibilities were deprioritized, not because they were disproven but because resources and confidence shifted elsewhere. And this distinction mattered because it reframed the outcome not as a solved mystery but as a concluded process. Crucially, the report addressed the procedural detail that had sparked everything, explaining its purpose, its timing, and why it had never been publicly disclosed, and in doing so it acknowledged that the boundary between internal knowledge and family communication had blurred unintentionally, creating a situation where restricted information circulated privately and later surfaced without context. This admission did not assign blame, but it accepted responsibility, and responsibility restored credibility in a way silence never could, because it validated public concern without validating speculation, and that balance mattered. Family members responded with mixed emotions. Grief resurfaced, but so did relief. Relief that long-standing doubts were not dismissed, relief that uncertainty was finally named, and relief that the story no longer rested on absolute claims that had never fully fit their lived experience. And in acknowledging complexity, they found a different kind of peace, one rooted in honesty rather than certainty. The intermediary's role was clarified, formally described as supportive but insufficiently defined, and the report recommended clear boundaries in future cases to prevent informal influence from shaping narrative unintentionally, a quiet but significant institutional lesson drawn directly from this experience. The livestream speaker issued a final statement recognizing their error in referencing non-public information and apologizing for the confusion it caused. This acknowledgement closed the loop on the initial breach, transforming it from a source of suspicion into a catalyst for accountability. Public discourse shifted accordingly. Speculation gave way to analysis, anger softened into understanding, and while not everyone was satisfied, few could deny that the truth had moved closer to the surface than it had been in years. No criminal charges followed because none were warranted, but reforms did. Clearer communication protocols, mandatory external review thresholds, and transparency guidelines designed to prevent administrative closure from being mistaken for factual resolution, and in that way the case achieved something rare: it changed the system that had mishandled it. The story ends not with certainty but with clarity, and clarity is enough because it allows questions to rest without being buried, it allows trust to rebuild without pretending nothing went wrong, and it honors the truth without rewriting the past. What began as a single sentence spoken too freely became a mirror reflecting how silence can distort, how good intentions can mislead, and how truth, when acknowledged even quietly, has the power to resolve what time alone cannot. And that is how this case finally ended, not solved in the traditional sense but understood, and sometimes understanding is the most honest form of justice.